I was holding a cup of cold coffee when my phone lit up at 2:17 a.m. The number was local but unfamiliar. I almost didn't answer. At 63, late night calls usually mean someone's in the hospital or worse. I let it ring twice more before I picked up. There was breathing on the other end. Slow. Deliberate. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 38 years said, "It's me." I dropped the cup. It didn't break, just rolled across the hardwood floor, spilling what was left in a slow, dark trail. My hand was shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to stay upright. "Who is this?" I managed to say, though I already knew. Somewhere deep in my chest, beneath all the years and all the grief, I knew. "It's Claire, my sister's name. My sister, who had been 22 when she died in a car accident in 1986. My sister whose funeral I had sat through in a numb haze, surrounded by flowers I couldn't smell and people I couldn't hear. My sister, whose grave I visited every year on her birthday with yellow roses because those were her favorite." "This isn't funny," I whispered. "I know," the voice said. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I need you to listen. I should have hung up. I should have blocked the number and gone back to bed and convinced myself it was a prank, some cruel stranger who'd done their research. But I didn't, because even through the static and the years and the impossibility of it all, that voice carried something I recognized, a slight rasp on certain consonants, a rhythm that matched the way my sister used to talk when she was scared. "Where are you?" I asked. "I can't tell you yet, but I need you to know. I'm alive. I've been alive this whole time." The floor seemed to tilt under me. I sat down hard in one of the kitchen chairs, still holding the phone so tight my knuckles ached. "That's not possible." "I know how it sounds," she said. "But I'm going to prove it to you. Do you remember the summer before I left for college? We broke into the old Miller house on Ashford Street. You twisted your ankle jumping off the porch, and I had to help you home. We told Mom you tripped on the sidewalk. I hadn't thought about that in decades. We'd never told anyone. Not our parents, not our younger brother Danny, not anyone." "How do you know that?" I asked, though my voice had gone hollow. "Because I was there, Jamie. Because I'm your sister." I sat in the dark for a long time after she hung up. She'd said she would call again in 3 days. That she needed time to prepare. That I couldn't tell anyone yet. Not Mom, not Danny, not the police. She made me promise, and I did. Because I didn't know what else to do. By the time the sun came up, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But 3 days later, the phone rang again. This time she told me the truth. Claire had been 22 and engaged to a man named Eric Holloway. I remembered him vaguely. Tall, charming, worked in finance. Drove a silver BMW. My parents had loved him. He had the kind of smile that made people trust him immediately, and he always brought wine to dinner and complimented my mother's cooking. Claire had seemed happy. At least, I thought she had. I was 25 at the time, working my first real job as a junior accountant, and I didn't see her as much as I should have. We talked on the phone every couple of weeks. She told me about wedding plans, flowers, venues, a honeymoon in Greece. Then one night in October she called me crying. She said Eric had changed. That he'd started tracking her whereabouts, questioning her about male coworkers, isolating her from friends. She said she wanted to leave him, but she was afraid. He'd told her if she tried, he'd make sure she regretted it. I told her to come stay with me. I told her I'd help her. But she said she needed to handle it carefully. She said she'd figure it out. 2 weeks later, she was dead. The police said her car had gone off a bridge on Route 9 during a rainstorm. The vehicle had been found submerged in the river. They'd recovered a body, badly decomposed, they said, due to the water and the time it took to locate the wreck. Dental records confirmed it was her. Eric had identified some of her personal effects, her purse, her ring. We buried her on a cold November afternoon. I had never questioned it. None of us had. But now, 38 years later, Claire was telling me that the body in that grave wasn't hers. "Eric planned it," she said, her voice tight and low over the phone. "He knew I was going to leave him. He'd been planning it for weeks. He found a woman, a hitchhiker, a runaway. I don't know. Someone no one would miss. He killed her and staged the accident. He made sure the body was unrecognizable. He paid off the medical examiner to confirm the dental records without actually checking them. And then he made sure I disappeared. How? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He drugged me the night before the accident. When I woke up, I was in a basement somewhere. He kept me there for 3 days. Then he moved me to a private psychiatric facility upstate, Wellbrook Manor. He had papers, legal documents that said I was mentally unstable, a danger to myself. He had a doctor who signed off on everything. My name was changed, my records were sealed, and I was locked away. I felt like I was going to be sick. For 38 years, I said. For 38 years. Why didn't you call someone? Why didn't you? I tried, she said, and her voice cracked. I tried so many times, but no one believed me. They said I was delusional. They said I had a break from reality. They medicated me so heavily I couldn't think straight. And Eric visited. Every few months he'd come to make sure I stayed quiet. He'd sit across from me in the visitor's room and smile and tell me that if I ever told anyone the truth, he'd kill you. He'd kill Danny. He'd kill Mom and Dad. And I believed him, Jamie. I believed him because I'd already seen what he was capable of. I couldn't breathe. I sat there in my kitchen, staring at the wall, trying to process what she was telling me. Mom and Dad are dead, I said quietly. Dad passed in 2003. Mom in 2011. There was a long silence. I know, she finally said. One of the nurses told me a few years ago. She was kind. She used to sneak me newspapers sometimes. Why are you calling now? I asked. Why now, after all this time? Because Eric's dying, she said. Cancer. Stage 4. He's in hospice care. And 2 weeks ago, the payments to Wellbrook stopped. The facility's been sold to a new management company, and they're reviewing all the old cases. A social worker came to see me last week. She started asking questions. She said some of the original documentation didn't add up. She said she's going to petition for my release. Then you're free, I said, feeling a strange, dizzying rush of hope. Not yet, Claire said, but soon. And when I am, I need your help. I need you to help me prove what he did. I didn't sleep for the next 2 weeks. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner I didn't eat. I sat in front of my laptop and searched for everything I could find about Eric Holloway. He'd done well for himself. He'd remarried a year after Claire's death. A woman named Diane, a real estate agent. They'd had 2 kids, now adults. He'd built a successful investment firm. He'd donated to charities. He'd been profiled in the local business journal as a pillar of the community. And now he was dying in a hospice facility 20 minutes from my house. I thought about going to see him. I thought about walking into that room and asking him to his face if he'd done what Claire said he did. But I didn't, because I knew he'd lie. And I knew I'd lose my nerve. Instead, I waited. 3 weeks after that first phone call, I got another one. This time, it was from a woman named Margaret Pryor. She introduced herself as a social worker with the New York State Office of Mental Health. She said she was handling a case involving a woman named Catherine Wells, Claire's assumed name, and that Catherine had listed me as her sister. She's provided some information that we're currently investigating, Margaret said carefully. But I wanted to reach out to you directly. She says you may have documentation or photographs that could help verify her identity. I told her I did. I told her I'd bring everything I had. 2 days later, I drove 3 hours north to Wellbrook Manor. It was a sprawling old estate that had been converted into a long-term care facility. The grounds were neat but institutional. The building itself looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Gray stone, narrow windows, wrought iron gates. Margaret met me in the lobby. She was in her mid-40s, with short graying hair and the kind of tired, focused expression that comes from years of dealing with broken systems. She walked me through a series of locked doors and down a long, quiet hallway. And then she opened a door to a small meeting room, and I saw my sister for the first time in 38 years. She looked old. That was the first thing I noticed. She was 60 now, and the years had worn her down in ways I wasn't prepared for. Her hair was mostly gray. Her face was lined and thin. Her hands shook slightly when she reached for the table to steady herself. But her eyes were the same. Jamie, she said, and her voice broke. I didn't remember crossing the room. I just remember holding her, feeling how small and fragile she'd become, and trying not to cry because I didn't want to scare her. "I'm here," I said. "I'm here." The next 3 months were a careful, quiet war. Margaret began by reviewing Claire's original commitment documents. She found inconsistencies immediately. The signatures on several forms didn't match. The psychiatric evaluation had been conducted by a doctor who'd had his license revoked in 1991 for falsifying patient records. The dental records that had supposedly confirmed Claire's death had never been properly filed with the county coroner. Margaret brought in a forensic psychiatrist to evaluate Claire. He spent 4 hours with her over 2 days. His report concluded that she showed no signs of psychosis, delusion, or impaired reality testing. He noted that she had been over-medicated for decades, and that her cognitive function was consistent with someone who had been institutionalized under false pretenses. Then Margaret contacted the medical examiner's office that had handled Claire's case in 1986. The original examiner had died in 1998, but his successor agreed to review the file. He found that the autopsy report was incomplete. Key details were missing. The chain of custody for the dental records was unclear. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to raise serious questions. Meanwhile, I went to see a lawyer, a woman named Catherine Ortiz who specialized in cases involving wrongful institutionalization and medical fraud. She listened to everything I had to say, took notes, and then leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "This is going to be hard," she said. "Even if we can prove your sister was committed unlawfully, going after Eric Holloway for what he did in 1986 is going to be complicated. The statute of limitations on most of the crimes he could be charged with has expired. And if he's in hospice, he may not live long enough to face trial." "I don't care," I said. "I just want the truth on record. I want people to know what he did." Catherine nodded slowly. "Then we'll make sure they do. Eric Holloway died on a Tuesday in late April. The obituary in the paper called him a devoted husband, father, and philanthropist. It mentioned his career, his charitable work, his love of sailing. It said he was survived by his wife, 2 children, and 4 grandchildren. It didn't mention Claire. But by then, the story was already starting to come out. Margaret had filed an official petition with the state, requesting a full investigation into Claire's commitment and the circumstances surrounding her supposed death. A local journalist picked up on it, after a tip from someone in the mental health office. He called me. I didn't want to talk to him at first, but Catherine convinced me it was the right move. "Public pressure matters," she said, "especially when the systems that failed your sister are still in place." So I talked to him. I told him everything, carefully, quietly, without exaggeration. I gave him documents. I gave him photos of Claire from before she disappeared. I gave him the names of people who could corroborate parts of her story. The article ran 2 weeks after Eric's death. It was front-page news in the local paper and picked up by a few regional outlets. The headline read, "Woman allegedly held in psychiatric facility for 38 years after fiancé faked her death." The response was immediate. Eric's widow, Diane, released a statement through her lawyer denying the allegations. She called the story a cruel fabrication and an attack on her late husband's legacy. His children refused to comment, but other people came forward. A woman who had worked as a nurse at Wellbrook in the early 1990s contacted Margaret and said she'd always thought there was something wrong with Catherine Wells's case. She said the patient had never seemed mentally ill, just scared and medicated into compliance. A retired detective who had worked Claire's accident case in 1986 reached out and said he'd had concerns at the time. He said the scene had felt staged. He said he'd tried to push for a more thorough investigation, but his superiors had shut him down. Eric Holloway had been well connected even then. And then, in June, the district attorney's office announced that they were reopening the investigation into Claire's disappearance and the 1986 death that had been attributed to her. It took another year for everything to come together. The state's investigation concluded that Claire had been unlawfully committed and held at Wellbrook Manor under false pretenses. The facility's former director, who had signed off on her admission, had died years earlier, but the state found evidence that he'd accepted payments from Eric Holloway, over a period of more than a decade. The medical examiner's office reviewed the 1986 case and determined that the body recovered from the river had never been properly identified. A new forensic analysis of the remains, still preserved in a county storage facility, revealed that the dental records didn't match Claire's actual dental history. The woman in the grave wasn't my sister. We still don't know who she was. In September, the DA filed charges against Eric Holloway's estate for fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment. It was a symbolic move. He was already dead, but it mattered. It meant the state was officially acknowledging what he'd done. Catherine also filed a civil suit on Claire's behalf against Wellbrook Manor, the state, and Eric Holloway's estate. The case was settled out of court 8 months later for an undisclosed amount. It wasn't about the money, Claire said. It was about making sure it was all on record, making sure no one could pretend it hadn't happened. Claire moved in with me that fall. She didn't have anywhere else to go. Her whole life had been taken from her, and she was still trying to figure out how to build a new one. It was hard at first. She had nightmares. She didn't like loud noises or unexpected visitors. She'd spent so long in a controlled environment that the simple act of choosing what to eat for breakfast sometimes overwhelmed her. But slowly, carefully, she started to come back to herself. She got a library card. She started going for walks in the park near my house. She reconnected with a few old friends, people who remembered her from before and who cried when they saw her again. Danny came to visit. He'd struggled the most with everything, I think. He'd been 19 when Claire died, and he'd spent most of his adult life believing she was gone. Seeing her again broke something open in him. He hugged her for a long time and didn't say anything, and that was enough. We went to the cemetery together one afternoon in late October. The three of us stood in front of the grave that had Claire's name on it, and we didn't really know what to say. "I used to come here on your birthday," I told her quietly. "I'd bring yellow roses." "I know," she said. "I mean, I didn't know, but I'm glad you did." We had the gravestone removed a few weeks later. The space is empty now. We're working with the county to see if we can identify the woman who was buried there, but it's been almost 40 years. It's not likely we'll ever know. Sometimes people ask me how I'm doing with all of it. How Claire's doing. If we're okay. I don't really know how to answer that. Claire lost almost 4 decades of her life. She missed our parents' deaths. She missed watching Danny's kids grow up. She missed everything. And there's no amount of money or justice or public apology that can give that back to her. But she's here. She's alive. And every morning when I wake up and hear her moving around in the kitchen, making tea or flipping through a magazine, I'm reminded that she survived. Not because anyone saved her, not because the system worked, but because she held on. Because even when it seemed impossible, even when she had every reason to give up, she didn't. I think about Eric sometimes. I think about how he lived a full, comfortable life while my sister was locked away. How he died surrounded by people who loved him and never had to face what he'd done. It's not fair. It'll never be fair. But the truth is out now, and that matters. If you've ever had to stay quiet just to survive, if you've ever had to wait years for someone to finally believe you, you're not alone.